Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist at American Compass, and our guest today is Ivana Greco, who is a former family law attorney, currently a homemaker raising several children. She's done wonderful research for American Compass on public policy as it affects stay-at-home parents. She's written on the issue for National Affairs. She writes for the Institute for Family Studies. She writes at her own Substack, The Homefront. And she's currently finishing up a fascinating research project speaking with stay-at-home parents about their own challenges, needs, and views on family policy and childcare in particular. So we talk about the role of childcare in our economy and our culture, ultimately in current public policy debates, and in particular how the different views of progressives and conservatives are translating into those policy disputes and being reflected in the current presidential campaign. So, hope you will stick around for that. But first, I have to tell you about everything else going on at American Compass. This week on The Commons, we have Sam Silvestro writing on conservative approaches on family policy. Anthony Constantini is writing about why the right should be interested in the Federal Reserve. And we've just published an update to our Coin Flip Capitalism project, looking at the continuing unimpressive performance of private equity, venture capital, and hedge funds. So please take a look at all of that. Of course, if you are not already subscribed to Understanding America, I don't know what you're doing, but you still can at understandingamerica.co, where I write every Monday about what I'm thinking about and then share all the best reading from around the web on Fridays. And with that, here's Ivana Greco. And joining us now on the podcast is Ivana Greco. Ivana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Oren. I'm very honored to be on the podcast.
Well, we are honored to have you. Ivana is a longtime friend of Compass, has published some great work for us, and certainly I'm always reading everything she is publishing elsewhere, particularly because I think there is much policy analysis done on the problems of the American family and not nearly enough time spent actually talking to families and reporting back what challenges folks face, what policies do and don't help, and how they even understand the role of policy and government in supporting family. So, Ivana, I know you've been working for a while on a forthcoming report. Let's start there. What have you been focusing on, and what have you been learning?
So it's a report I'm really excited about. I've been working with my colleague Elliot Haspel through a organization called Capita, and we're doing a deep dive into who stay-at-home parents are and what they want, what they need, what kind of support they're looking for. And so one of the things that is exciting, in my opinion, about this project is that Elliot and I approach this issue from very different ends of the political spectrum. There's a lot that we disagree upon when it comes to policy generally, family policy, childcare, but we both agree that stay-at-home parents are a really important part of the, if you think about the childcare system as like a holistic group of the people who actually take care of children in the United States, stay-at-home parents are actually an integral part of it. There are millions of families that have either mom or dad working part-time or not at all, and then devoting the rest of their time to taking care of a child during the day. So they're a group that has really been left out of the national conversation about childcare. They're long overdue for someone to take a serious look at who they are and what they need. So we have conducted a survey with the help of a third party of 1,300 parents who, and we used a little bit of an unusual definition. We did not exclude parents who make some amount of money because in my experience, many stay-at-home parents pick up some money some way, somehow. I mean, some of them work full time, doing night shifts as a nurse, for example. Many of them work ad hoc, like maybe giving music lessons or caring for a child in a home, a child who's not their own, and some of them work part time. So we surveyed 1,300 parents who had a child under 12 in their primary care during the day. So like time when you otherwise might expect a child to be in school or in daycare or with a babysitter. We asked them a bunch of questions about who they are, but we also asked them a bunch of questions about what they need. What problems are they running into? What help do they want? And then we also conducted 4 focus groups with rural parents, a group that was Spanish speaking only, for which we used a translator, and then 2 groups with parents who consider their religious beliefs to be a central factor in their lives, to talk to people, hopefully, a broad cross section of people about why they stay home, what problems they have, and what help they want.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting point about the definition of stay-at-home parent. What's relevant isn't whether they're staying at home or not, in a sense. What's relevant is that they are the primary caregiver for a child. And so to your point about thinking about these parents as a key element of the entire fabric of people who care for kids in this country, it's not a question of whether they're also doing other work or not. It's a question of um, whether they have in their families chosen to arrange things so that they're the one providing the care. I'm struck by the who you chose and who you didn't choose to focus in on in the focus groups, because if I were to think about that set, the sort of rural or non-urban families, um, Spanish speaking families in particular, and those with strong religious backgrounds that are influencing their choices, in a sense that it sounds like the everybody who is not the urban professionals who tend to be dictating a lot of the policy conversation. And certainly something we found at American Compass is that you see this exact split, that the assumption that people want sort of commercial paid daycare for their kids is the preference of only one group, and that group is the college educated 6-figure income household. Everybody else prefers other arrangements, whether it is a parent providing the care or more informal, neighborhood care, extended family care, church provided care. Um, is that what you found, or did the focus groups sort of point to other things you didn't expect?
So first off, I would say that you're exactly right. And we used income limits when we did the survey it's not that we weren't interested in what wealthy parents want, but that was not the target of this particular study. Our income limits were such that we did not particularly look at the preferences of, um, you know, a couple who both have advanced degrees and are making $250,000 a year. And part of that was, as you say, much of our policy conversation is shaped by people in that class. So we really wanted to include voices from elsewhere. And part of it was that those people have great options. So when they're looking for childcare, they can afford the daycare that is good. They can afford the nanny that's going to provide the one on one attention. um, they're not struggling. And so what we found is everywhere else, people really are struggling. So they're struggling because they can't find childcare that is affordable, even when both of them have to work. One couple I interviewed, not as part of this project, but beforehand, um, but just made such an impression on me, is a married mom and dad who live in New York State. They both worked at a manufacturing plant. And when they had their first um, child, they put the baby in daycare, but their lives, it was just like it was killing them. They would go to the plant, they would work a shift, they would come home, have time to feed, chicken nuggets before bed, and then go to bed, and they were just dying. And they did not have, like, mom's salary was basically just totally eaten up by childcare. So they were like, what are we doing? Is this even worth it? So then they moved to opposite shifts So somebody could be home during the day. I forget who was working the night shift and who was working the day shift, but they moved to opposite shifts. But like that was like also terrible. Like they never saw each other basically. And that really wasn't working too. And again, like the money just wasn't really working out. And so finally she quit her job. They moved into somebody's parents' basement. I can't remember if it's mom or dad. They live in the basement. The kids are at home. Dad is working still at the same manufacturing plant, but he got a raise. They still can't afford to move out, but she's like, it is so much better. Like, I see the kids, we have quality of life. Dad's working his butt off, but life is now tolerable and it's worth it to live in this basement so we can make this work. And so that kind of story is the sort of thing we heard again and again and again in the focus groups where people just are really struggling with the choices that they have. If you do not make a lot of money in this country, the options for you to care for your children are not good, not what you want. Um, I think that is part of why we see such pressure in the polls for politicians to do something, because a lot of people are really struggling.
Yeah, that story underscores something that I've been writing about. I want to run by you and get your reaction to. Quick plug, self plug for Understanding America, my Substack, where I just wrote about this. Is this question of sort of childcare affordability, and to what extent is the cost of the childcare really the issue? Because in that sort of story, what strikes me is that the fundamental problem isn't the cost of childcare per se. It's that we no longer have an economy where one income supports a family, and that all of these other issues, with the cost of childcare being one of them, is downstream of the fact that one income doesn't support a family. Because of course, if income does support a family, as used to be the case, there are still many, many families where a second parent might also choose to work, and you might then need to pay a lot for childcare. But that would be a manageable trade-off because the first income is already covering the basic costs. It feels like the problem we have today is that the economy is one that requires two incomes if you don't have a particularly high paying job. And yet, if you have to pay for childcare to make the two incomes work, well, now the budget still doesn't work out. And that's where that sort of disappearance of choice comes from. You've gone from a world where one income supports the family, which means you truly can choose what trade-offs you want to make. Do you want to have both parents working and pay for childcare, to one where you have no choice but to have the two incomes, or do something like move into the parents' basement, or make other trade-offs that are just kind of not consistent with the basics of middle class security. Um, and so then you have to go that route, but then you have to have the childcare. But if you have to pay for the childcare, the numbers still don't add up. Um, is that the right story, or does that miss some of what's going on?
No, I mean, I think in many ways, the debate over childcare is a debate over a symptom rather than a disease. I agree that a big part of the problem with childcare is very related to the lack of stable, good paying jobs. And in fact, when part of the survey results that we did kicked out that a big problem that people see is a lack of good paying, stable jobs for people, especially who are working or lower class. That's one of the main problems they identified, along with housing costs and healthcare costs. Um, we have many challenges that are facing us, but the fact that dad can't get a job that supports the family, or in some families it's mom. Families today really are very variable. So even putting aside one parent families, single mom or single dad families. One of the results we found in both our survey and our focus groups is a lot of families now have stay at home dads. It's over 20% of families that have a parent at home. So families are organizing themselves in modern, quote unquote, modern ways, different ways, to try to eke the best they can out of the economy. Sometimes it makes most sense for mom to have the full-time job and dad to be home. Um, but yeah, I think people just feel like they don't have choices. And most of the reason they don't have choices is that somebody, whether it be mom or whether it be dad, can't go out and get a job that has good healthcare benefits, good retirement benefits, and pays a good income enough so that they can care for their kids in the way they want. And I should say, talking to these parents, it is agonizing to be in a childcare situation you are not happy with. And I relate to this very much because even I worked as an attorney for a long time. I'm now mostly a stay-at-home mom myself, um, and so even with all the resources at my disposal, when I was working as an attorney, I had best case scenario. I was very unhappy not being with my little kids. And I had the benefit of knowing that I could put them in a good childcare situation. And so for a mother who has to send her child off to a daycare that she doesn't like, that she doesn't feel comfortable with, it's awful. She just feels terrible, and dad does too. So this is like when you talk to a parent about how to care for their child, you're talking about like probably the most important issue in their life. How to raise and nurture their son or daughter. So this is an issue that is like very much close to the heart for families, and we're just not doing a good job with it.
Yeah, I'm glad you put it in those terms because I think it underscores many ways that this is not just a question of kind of economically rational optimization of income. I mean, there is obviously a wide range of values related questions up front about what is most important to people, and then even beyond that, there are just very sort of real emotional issues of kind of that drive life satisfaction and how people are feeling about their own lives, quite disconnected from how much they're able to consume, right? Be having the car with the air conditioning or the bigger TV or whatever else of modern life doesn't make up at all for those kinds of trade-offs that, of course, economists just don't really have any way to measure. um, I'm curious about the choice element, though, in terms of what people do want, because I think that's where this then moves toward the question of what is the most effective sort of model of policy to help address this. And obviously, people are going to want many different things. But what do you find, both from the survey and from the focus groups, and from all the other work that you've done, that sort of best captures what people want, even if it's a few different kind of categories of things? How should we think about what the either the ideal would be, or what would best meet the aspirations that people really have?
So, as you also know, we know that for working and middle class people, generally what they want, the plurality of people, is to spend a significant amount of time at home with their young kids. So when you look at the surveys, for everybody except the upper class, their choice is either to care for their child at home themselves, um, which is often the most popular option, or to have grandma or grandpa or a relative take care of them. So most people want family to be the one taking care of babies and toddlers. That said, there is incredible variability in family situations, and what people want and need. Um, for example, if you have a child with a significant developmental delay, for many of the families, there's just no way to operate throughout childhood without having a parent at home dedicated to the care of that child. So I talked to a number of parents uh, with children with very serious medical conditions where it's often mom just has to be at home, or that child's not going to be taken care of. I talked to a mom whose husband is in the armed services, and the number of moves that they have and the way the family operates when dad is deployed, absolutely the best call for their family and their needs was for mom to be home. So I think the most important thing we can offer in a childcare policy is to offer flexibility. Families need that. You are never going to capture all the many gradations of what a family's calculus is, in terms of having someone home versus having someone working. And we also heard that in the focus groups that, one woman said to me, what I really want is cash, basically, that they, in this issue particularly, what they need is flexibility, to make the choice that works best for their family. But unfortunately, what we have largely gotten from government policy is a one size fits all solution, which is that, and this is a bipartisan problem, that what politicians envision is two working families, and to the extent aid is given, it is given in creating external childcare solutions. But a lot of families either don't want external childcare, or, for many reasons, it's not going to work for their family.
And so, what is I guess it's interesting that, to your point about wanting, whether it is sort of a stay at home parent or family based care, my sense is there's an argument, and I was struck in a recent story that I was quoted in, and then a sort of very progressive analyst from Center for American Progress was quoted as well. The progressive argument seemed to be that one of the reasons to focus on the sort of subsidized childcare is that, in fact, childcare in that environment is better for the kids, and that we sort of, to say otherwise is to devalue the important work done in the childcare centers. And while not intending to devalue that work at all, it seems to me that that is certainly not how most families feel, and also that the evidence for that I don't think is especially good. Are there families who have a sense that actually they wish they could afford the childcare, or they wish they want better childcare options because they think that would actually be better for the child, or is there generally a feeling that the best thing, especially for those youngest kids, is to be at home with parents or family?
So, yes, when you talk to an ordinary family, most of them will say the right spot for my child to be is at home. Um, and I totally agree that we need to value childcare workers. They are not valued or respected enough, and the job that they do is very hard. It's very important, and I agree that it needs to be honored. However, I reject the idea that um, all families are better served when their young children are in external childcare. There is quite strong evidence that for families that are dysfunctional, like, and there's a difference between being in poverty and being dysfunctional. You can be very poor and have a very functional family, but you also can be very poor and have a very dysfunctional family. So for children who are in a dysfunctional environment, it can indeed be positive for them to be in a stable form of external childcare. So, that's part of the motivation between, for example, the Head Start programs, that you do see some benefits if, mom's on drugs or mom's just not, she suffers from severe postpartum depression and there's no one else to help. Um, those kids can benefit from some structured external childcare. For everybody else, the evidence is much weaker. Um, it really depends on the quality of childcare that's available. And it's also a minefield of a field to do research in. So I talked to one child development expert who didn't want to be identified, but was like, it's really, really, really hard to get good statistics in this field because people have such strong opinions and no one wants to hear, that you could damage your child by putting them in daycare. So, you know, and I it's I'm also very sympathetic to this. I know as a mother, and my older two children were in daycare, and I certainly do not think that they were, permanently damaged in any way by being in daycare. So um, I'm very cognizant that this is an issue that people have really, really strong feelings about. Um, but I do not think that for all or even the majority of American families, daycare is obviously a better option for the child. I'll just put it that way. And we see it's interesting. We see some of the most clear evidence of this. People feel comfortable talking about it when they talk about maternity leave. So that's where we get the scientists lining up and say, yes, moms really need to have maternity leave to promote bonding with the baby, so that the baby can be in the care of a single caregiver. That's really good for babies, someone who connects and knows the baby well. So we do have kind of like an established consensus that we need maternity leave to promote these stable attachments that are so formative for life for children. There's not the same consensus once a child gets older, and for some of that, it's for good reason. Once a child reaches 3 or 4, preschool can be beneficial. But it's very hard to get data that I would consider to be particularly good on like the mid-range, like 6 months to 4 years. And I think part of that is like people just have a really hard time talking about that topic.
Yeah, and to put a finer point on it, that maybe that I will than you will. The very concrete issue here is that the entire uh, sort of professional elite that does choose to pursue careers that require putting children in those care environments um, is not willing to conduct research or be told that they are in fact doing a disservice to their child in any way as a result. And so, of course, that it's also possible that that's the case. To your point, that it's not as if the evidence suggests there's necessarily dramatic harm done, but uh, any finding that kids would benefit from being at home with a parent would be quite difficult to process in a professional culture that is built around doing the opposite. Um, and so, it's interesting. There's, for instance, an excellent essay in National Affairs that was published a number of years ago, but we'll put it in the show notes. And I definitely recommend it because it was an attempt to synthesize the work that had been done. And it's sort of a very modest, neutral literature review in a sense, and yet quickly became one of the most controversial things National Affairs had ever published, because to go through the data that does exist, especially when you're talking about sort of large scale um, programs, and there's now been, I think, good research in Ottawa. There was good research in a program in Tennessee. Um, Typically, the outcomes uh, do not look especially good. And I think that's certainly something that the system has a hard time processing. Of course, the opposite is also true. Any result that were to suggest that parents somehow harm their kids or leave their kids worse off, and they should really be taking them off to sending them off to daycare would be equally unpopular, and so you're sort of left uh, with with this issue that in one sense is hugely politicized and yet in another just not discussed at all. I am curious about, you mentioned you're working with Elliot Haspel on this. He's a very well respected researcher in the field. Also, I think he writes very interesting stuff. But he obviously has a very different view on some of these questions. Without speaking for him, it would be interesting to kind of look at that side of it a little bit, though. And so, um, what are some of those key differences, do you think, that sort of drive some of the conflicts, especially as we get into the politics and policy making?
Yeah, so without speaking for Elliot, who is well able to speak for himself on this issue, I'll just identify what I see sort of on the left of center among people who would consider themselves progressive. So, one of the major issues they see is that of gender equality. And when you talk about childcare, a big issue that comes up is that for many people who are consider themselves to be feminists, they affirmatively want more women in the workforce. They think it's better for women, it's better for society in general. We see this a lot in the Scandinavian countries, where they have a big emphasis on ensuring that women actually are in the workforce. And this is this particular strand of feminism is very old, like all the way back to Simone de Beauvoir, who wanted to outlaw stay-at-home mothers, so that we could achieve true gender equality. So that is, I would say, one of the major issues. A second issue is the idea that early childhood care can be used to fix general issues of inequality in the United States. So whether we're talking about racial inequality or socioeconomic equality, that we can use early childcare not only to resolve sex inequality, but also other forms of inequality. So we'll give the theory is that we'll give every child basically like a really good start through early childhood education, and that will create a more equitable country, a better country. Basically, that will through toddlers, we can improve the country.
And so that's where the division then comes in a lot of cases between a right of center that I think at this point is generally much more focused on the kind of flexibility you were describing earlier. You have all the various family benefit proposals now. Hawley has one, Senator Romney has one, Senator Vance has sort of alluded to his support for a much larger child tax credit. Senator Rubio has supported a much larger child tax credit. And the idea there is if you were able to provide significantly more resources to these working families, um, they will then be brought closer to the situation where they genuinely have choice and can afford to have a parent stay at home, or for that matter, can afford to pay for the cost of childcare if they want to have both parents working. Um, Whereas the left of center approach is focused much more on, in fact, directly making the childcare option the more attractive one. So there's lots of public support if if and only if you are opting to use the childcare programs that are offered. Um, is that a fair summary, or do you see other sort of policy ideas out there that are getting or that deserve more focus?
I think that that's true. I would also say that my fundamental disagreement with kind of the progressive side of things is that I believe that it is very pro woman to enable women to make the choices that work best for them and their families. I don't think the progressive formulation is right, because I think that for women, life, and for men, for everybody, life is more than your career and how much money you make. And so um, I I just fundamentally disagree. And I should say, like, I am 100% and you do have to say that this these days, I'm 100% in favor of women's rights. I think it is wonderful that women have reached the heights of academia and of law and of corporate governance. I'm cheering them on. You know, that is wonderful. But I do think that for many women, and also for many men, but for many women, as I found, um, I was just not happy pursuing a legal career. And this is not to tout my own background, but I graduated from Harvard Law School. I know the appeal of what it means to really pursue a high achieving career, but I wanted to be with my kids. And so I think from a conservative or right of center perspective, we should not be shy about saying that providing choice is pro woman. It is supporting women because women, just like men, do not fall into one cookie cutter mode. And so for some people, the hard charging two career model is not a good one. And it's cutting out other integral values for their life. And when it comes to children, this is certainly not the case for all progressives, but there is a model that I also fundamentally disagree with, which is that we're going to take all these 3 and 4 year olds, we're going to teach them the ABCs really young, we're going to stress academic education really young, and then through this modification of these toddlers, they're going to go off to school and be great and become hardworking and productive members of society and fix all these problems. And so that is how we get that programs that really neglect what a toddler needs, which is not to be um, enrolled in academics as early as possible, but to form strong attachment bonds with a primary caregiver, whether that be mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, in some cases, an external child caregiver, and then use that secure foundation to then move on um, into their later life. In my view, what a baby or a toddler needs is not to be changed, not to, I'm always very suspicious of evidence-based practices when it comes to kids this little. It's to get a chance to be a little kid, to bake cookies with grandma, to run around and play on the playground, not to somehow, and I'm not saying the whole progressive view is like this, but I have heard people who essentially boil down to this, not to be kind of a mechanism by which, and you also see this on the right, by the way, but not to be a mechanism by which you are going to fix society. We want to value them in and of themselves. And sometimes that means the best place for them to be is at home.
Yeah, it's a good point that we hear this on both sides of the political spectrum. I mean, on the right of center, there is both the sort of education as the civil rights issue of our time model, where as much as conservatives tend to be skeptical of big government programs, somehow it was going to be the brick building run by the government in every town across the country, taking up by far the largest share of state and local budgets, on par with what we spend on the Department of Defense. And we're going to send all the kids into those buildings, and that was somehow going to solve whatever was wrong with society. You also see it on the parent side, which we haven't talked about as much, is you mentioned sort of from the perspective of the kind of progressive feminist movement, the focus on getting more women into the workforce. There's also on the kind of more neoliberal left and right this idea that this is simply a kind of model for GDP growth and consumption maximization. And every time we can bump the labor force participation rate up another point, every time we can get a few more people working, we've therefore somehow increased our prosperity, which I suppose is true from one definition of prosperity, but I think as you have described throughout this conversation is a rather blinkered conception of human flourishing. I want to wrap up back on your point about careers, though, and curious again about your focus group work, because I think what you described as the sort of, some people are passionate about their careers and that makes sense for them, is exactly right. It also speaks to me to an interesting distinction that, we found at American Compass in some of the survey work we did between essentially a quote career and a quote job. And one thing I find funny about the progressive argument in all of this is that it is, of course, also progressives who are constantly lamenting the low quality of so many of the jobs in the economy and everything that is wrong with work. And of course, most of the people making these decisions are not choosing between staying at home to raise a child and building a high-powered uh, career on Wall Street. They are choosing between sort of a job to earn more money and help make ends meet, and doing that work at home. Um, I'm curious what you found in your focus groups to the extent that that was discussed. We've talked a lot about how people view the home side of the equation. How did the folks in the focus groups think about the work side? Was it something they also wanted to be doing, that they would like to get to if they can? Was it something they felt they had to be doing but wished they didn't have to do as much? Where did that fit into their life and their calculations?
So we did find that a number of people currently at home would be working if they had better childcare available to them. Um, One thing that we are hoping to do in further research is what that means, because that means a lot of things to different people. As you know, I hope I've explained. These stay-at-home parents, many of them do work, and in like a very wide variety of ways. So, part of what I'm curious to know is when people say they want to go back to work if they had better childcare available to them, does that mean they want a full-time job, part-time job, ability to make some money? What's going on there? And I'm also very curious. There's good polling out there that shows us that a lot of people who are working want to be home with their kids. So part of the problem that we've got in our economy right now is that there are a bunch of people who are home who don't want to be, and then there are a bunch of people who are in the workforce who would rather be home with their kids. So we've not done a good job providing agency to people to make the choices that they want to make. So that was one bucket of people, and they're a large one. Then there's another bucket of people who um, see their role as in caring for their kids as just like the central role of their lives. I talked to a mother with 7 children. They're really struggling. They can't afford gas to go see family. Like her kids are bigger now. I'm sure you're aware how much teen boys eat. And so when she goes grocery shopping, she's always like, is it going to work this week or not? And but for her, there's just no substitute to being with her kids. And when you have 7 kids, it's very hard. Like that's a lifetime project. She has a lifetime project already. She has a more than full-time occupation. Um, so yeah, we just have not, in terms of policy solutions, managed to meet people in what is, for many people, the most important issue of their lives, and that's a real shame.
Well, we will leave it there. Ivana Greco, this has been fantastic. We will wait with bated breath for the published report, and certainly American Compass will do what we can to get everybody reading it. Until then, thank you so much for joining the
Thank you very
podcast.
much, Oren. I was delighted to appear.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.